Everyone wants me to forgive my SIL for what she said about my dead daughter. They don't know what she whispered at the funeral. My wife and I lost our youngest daughter 4 months ago. She was 6. There's nothing I can say to make you understand what that does to a person, so I won't try. What I will say is that my sister-in-law Deborah made it infinitely worse. My brother Kyle and I have always been close, but Deborah has had some kind of grudge against my wife since the day they met. Little comments here and there about how we spoil our kids, how our son being a chess prodigy at 10 is unnatural, how our daughters dress too grown for their age. My wife ignored it. I ignored it. Kyle always brushed it off, saying Deborah was just hormonal because she's been pregnant twice in the last 3 years. That excuse stopped working for me at their pool party last month. It was supposed to be a good day. Our therapist said getting the kids around family might help with the grief. My parents were there, my aunts and uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years, everyone treating us gently, speaking softly, which we appreciated more than they knew. Deborah didn't say a word to us for the first 2 hours, which I thought was her version of being respectful. Then the kids started acting up. My nephew and a few of the older ones pushed me into the pool while I was standing near the edge. I laughed it off, kids being kids. But then they grabbed my wife's bag off the patio chair and threw it into the deep end, and when I fished it out, her phone screen was completely shattered. I gathered the kids, all of them including my nephews, and calmly explained why that kind of prank wasn't okay. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't being aggressive, I was just parenting. Deborah came storming across the patio and told me I had absolutely no right to discipline her children. My wife, still shaken from everything we'd been through, quietly said the kids needed to understand that actions have consequences. Deborah's face twisted into something ugly, and she said, "Maybe if you understood consequences, your daughter would still be alive." The entire backyard went dead silent. My wife's knees buckled and my mother had to catch her before she hit the ground. I stood frozen, watching Deborah's expression shift from rage to slow realization of what had just come out of her mouth. Kyle grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. I didn't follow. I took my wife and kids and left without saying goodbye. I didn't speak to a single family member for a week. Then the messages started. My mother called and said Deborah was struggling with her pregnancy hormones and that I needed to be the bigger person for the sake of family unity. My aunt sent a long paragraph about how grief affects everyone differently and that I should extend grace. Kyle texted me 4 times saying Deborah didn't mean it, that she cried for hours after, and that she desperately wanted to apologize. I didn't respond to any of them. 2 weeks later, Kyle showed up at my door with Deborah behind him looking like a child dragged to the principal's office. He asked if they could come inside. I let them. Deborah sat on my couch and delivered a tearful apology about how stressed she's been with the pregnancy, how she didn't mean what she said, how she's been battling depression and doesn't understand why she lashes out at people she loves. She said she wanted nothing more than my forgiveness so our families could heal. My wife wasn't home. She had taken the kids to her mother's house. It was just me and them. I let Deborah finish every word of her rehearsed speech. Then I looked at Kyle and asked, "Do you remember what you said to me the night we found out Emily didn't make it?" He looked confused. I reminded him. He had held me in the hospital hallway and told me, "Whatever you and your wife need, I'm here. I don't care what it costs me. You're my brother." I asked him if he meant it. He said, of course. I looked at Deborah and told her I would never forgive her. Not today, not next year, not ever. I told her my daughter's name would never come out of her mouth again, and if I ever heard she mentioned Emily to anyone in the family for any reason, I would tell everyone at the next gathering what she whispered to my wife at the funeral. Kyle's face went white. Deborah's eyes went wide and nothing came out of her mouth. See, what nobody knows is that Deborah pulled my wife aside during the reception after we buried our baby. She waited until my wife was alone near the bathroom and leaned in close. My wife told me what Deborah said that night through sobs so violent I thought she would collapse. She begged me not to start a war while we were still raw, so I kept it to myself. 4 months without a word. Kyle stared at his wife like he was seeing a stranger. He asked what I was talking about. He asked what Deborah said at the funeral. Deborah started shaking her head, tears running down her face, begging me not to say it. I looked at my brother, the man who had been my best friend for 32 years, and I told him exactly what his wife whispered to mine while our 6-year-old daughter lay in a casket 20 feet away. I told Kyle that Deborah leaned close to my wife by the bathroom and whispered, "Maybe if you'd been watching her better, she'd still be alive." Kyle's face went completely white. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He stared at Deborah like he'd never seen her before. Deborah shook her head so hard I thought she might hurt herself. Tears poured down her face. She reached for Kyle's arm, but he jerked away like she'd burned him. I stood there watching it all happen. 4 months of keeping that secret. 4 months of protecting Deborah because my wife begged me not to start a war. Now it was out in the open, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Part of me wanted to take it back. Part of me felt cold and satisfied. Kyle finally found his voice. It came out barely above a whisper when he asked me to tell him exactly what Deborah said at the funeral, word for word. I looked at Deborah. She was silently begging me not to say it again. Her hands were pressed together like she was praying. But I promised myself I would never protect her again after what she did to my wife. So I repeated it. Every single word. Kyle stumbled backward like I'd physically hit him. He sat down hard on my couch. His hands covered his face. Deborah started talking fast. The words tumbled out of her mouth in a rush. She said she was out of her mind with grief, too. She loved Emily. The pregnancy hormones made her say horrible things she didn't mean. She kept talking and talking, but Kyle didn't look at her. His whole body was shaking. I watched my brother sitting there and realized this might actually break them. Their marriage might not survive what just happened in my living room. I told them both to get out of my house right now. My voice sounded flat and cold even to my own ears. Kyle stood up without a word. He walked toward the door like he was moving through water. Deborah tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away. He told her to get in the car. His voice was flat and dead in a way I'd never heard from my little brother. They left. I stood in my doorway watching Kyle's car pull away. The taillights disappeared around the corner. I felt empty instead of victorious. The house was too quiet. I went back inside and sat on the same couch where Deborah had delivered her rehearsed apology. My hands were shaking. I'd just blown up my family. Maybe that made me as bad as Deborah. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. But then I thought about my wife sobbing in our bedroom that night after the funeral. I thought about how she blamed herself every day anyway. How Deborah's words had confirmed her worst fear. No, I did the right thing. My wife came home an hour later with the kids. I heard them before I saw them. My son was talking about something that happened at his grandmother's house. Normal kid chatter. Then my wife walked into the living room and saw my face. She sent the kids upstairs. She asked me what happened. I told her everything. How I'd finally said it out loud. How Kyle reacted. How Deborah begged me not to. How they left. My wife just sat down on the floor, right there in the middle of our living room. She started crying. Not the violent sobs from that night 4 months ago. Quieter tears that somehow felt worse. She said she was glad I finally told someone, but she was also scared of what comes next. The family splitting apart. Everyone choosing sides. More pain on top of pain we were already carrying. I got down on the floor with her. I held her. I promised that protecting her and our kids mattered more than keeping peace with people who hurt us. She nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel her whole body shaking. That night, my phone exploded. Messages from my mother, my father, my aunts and uncles, everyone demanding to know what I said to Kyle and Deborah. What happened? Why Kyle showed up at my parents' house and won't talk to anyone. My mother's text said he was just sitting in his old bedroom staring at the wall. I read every message. I didn't respond to any of them. I was too tired to explain or defend myself right now. My wife and I put our son to bed. He asked why we both looked sad. I told him we were just having a hard day. He hugged us both extra tight before he went to sleep. The next morning, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Owen standing there, my mother's brother. He looked worried. He said the whole family was in crisis and I needed to tell him what was going on. I almost shut the door in his face. But Owen had always been decent to us. He'd never made excuses for Deborah's comments over the years. So I let him in. We sat at my kitchen table. I explained everything. The pool party, the funeral, yesterday's confrontation. I watched his face change from concern to horror. Owen sat quiet for a long time after I finished talking. Finally, he said he had no idea Deborah said that. He was sorry for pushing me to forgive her. He understood now why I couldn't. Owen told me that Kyle hadn't spoken to Deborah since they left my house yesterday. She was staying at her sister's place while Kyle figured things out. My mother was panicking because she was worried about Deborah's pregnancy and the stress. But my father told her that Deborah created this situation herself. I felt a small bit of relief knowing at least some family members understood why I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Owen left after an hour. He hugged me before he went. 2 days passed with no word from Kyle. I kept checking my phone. Nothing. I started to worry about my brother even though I was still angry. My wife suggested I text him just to make sure he was okay. Not to talk about Deborah or the situation, just brother to brother. I sent a simple message asking if he needed anything. 3 hours later, he responded. Just 2 words. I need time. My son came downstairs that afternoon. He asked me why Uncle Kyle hadn't come over for their usual chess game this week. I realized the family explosion was affecting my kids too. Not just me and my wife. I tried to explain that adults sometimes have disagreements that take time to work through. But my son was 10 and smart enough to know something serious happened. He told me he missed Emily. He missed when the family felt normal. My heart broke all over again. I pulled him close and told him I missed those things too. My wife called our therapist the next morning and asked if we could come in right away. Ronald Fontana had been seeing us since 2 weeks after Emily died, and he knew our whole story. We sat in his office that afternoon while the kids stayed with my parents, and I explained what happened with Kyle and Deborah. My wife added details I left out, her voice shaking when she described finally having the funeral secret exposed. Ronald listened without interrupting, his hands folded on his desk, his face neutral. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and said that exposing the secret was my right after carrying it for 4 months. But now we needed to prepare for the fallout. He asked if I felt better or worse since telling Kyle. I sat there trying to figure out the answer. Part of me felt lighter, like I'd been holding my breath underwater and finally surfaced. But another part felt heavy with guilt about breaking Kyle's marriage apart. I told Ronald I honestly didn't know yet. My wife reached over and squeezed my hand. Ronald nodded and said that made sense, that big confrontations rarely give us the clean resolution we expect. He started asking questions about Emily, about how we'd been processing her death over the past 4 months. My wife's eyes filled with tears before she even started talking. She admitted that being angry at Deborah had been easier than facing the grief. Ronald asked what she meant. My wife explained that hating Deborah gave her something to focus on, a target for all the pain that had nowhere else to go. When she was replaying Deborah's cruel comments in her head, she wasn't thinking about Emily's empty bedroom, or the way her laugh sounded. Ronald turned to me and asked if I'd been doing the same thing. I wanted to say no, but sitting there in his office with my wife crying beside me, I realized he was right. I'd been channeling everything into anger at Deborah instead of processing that my baby was gone. The rage felt manageable. The grief felt like it would destroy me. My wife started sobbing and said she'd been avoiding the hardest part by focusing on hating Deborah instead of accepting that Emily was never coming home. She said she knew it was wrong, that she should be working through the grief properly, but every time she tried to think about Emily, the pain was so bad, she wanted to die. Ronald let her cry for a while before he spoke again. He said that using anger as a shield against grief was a normal survival mechanism, but it only delayed the healing we needed to do. The confrontation with Deborah had served its purpose by setting boundaries and protecting my wife from future harm. But now we had to face what we'd been avoiding. We left his office an hour later feeling raw and exhausted. My wife held my hand in the parking lot and said she was scared to let go of the anger because she didn't know what would be left. I told her we'd figure it out together. A week passed with no word from Kyle. I checked my phone constantly, wondering if he was okay, if his marriage was over, if he hated me for destroying his family. My wife kept telling me I did the right thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd gone too far. Then on Tuesday morning, my phone rang. Kyle's name appeared on the screen and my stomach dropped. I answered and his voice sounded tired. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral, just the two of us, no wives or parents or anyone else. I agreed immediately. We decided on a coffee shop halfway between our houses, a place neither of us had been before. I drove there Wednesday afternoon feeling more nervous than I'd felt in years. When I walked in, Kyle was already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes reminded me of how I looked in the weeks after Emily died. His hair was messy and he hadn't shaved. He stood up when he saw me and we hugged briefly before sitting down. Kyle pushed one of the coffee cups toward me and said he remembered how I took it. Black with 1 sugar. The gesture made my throat tight. We sat in silence for a minute before Kyle started talking. He said he'd been staying at our parents' house because he couldn't look at Deborah right now without feeling sick. He'd left their house the night of the confrontation and hadn't been back since. Deborah was staying with her sister. Kyle said he kept replaying every time Deborah made a snide comment about my family over the years. Every little dig about how we spoiled our kids or how my wife dressed them or how unnatural it was that our son was so good at chess. He'd always made excuses for her, told everyone to ignore it, said she was just hormonal or stressed or didn't mean it. He realized now that he'd been enabling her cruelty by refusing to call it out. Kyle looked at me with tears in his eyes and apologized for not protecting my wife and kids from Deborah's behavior. He said he'd failed as a brother and an uncle. I could see he meant it. I told him I appreciated the apology, that it meant a lot to hear him say it. Kyle asked how my wife was doing, and I said she was struggling but getting help. He nodded and stared into his coffee cup. I asked what he was going to do about his marriage. Kyle's face twisted with pain, and he said he didn't know yet. Deborah was pregnant, and he couldn't just abandon his kids. But every time he thought about going home, he remembered what she whispered to my wife at Emily's funeral. He said Deborah had been calling and texting constantly, apologizing and begging him to come home. She'd sent long messages about how sorry she was, how she'd get therapy, how she'd never hurt anyone again. But Kyle couldn't get past it. He asked me how my wife had survived carrying that around for 4 months. I told him the truth. She almost didn't. There were nights I found her on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Days when she couldn't get out of bed because the weight of Deborah's words combined with Emily's death was too much to carry. Kyle put his head in his hands and said he was so sorry. I believed him. Kyle started talking about Deborah's past, things he'd never told me before. He said Deborah had always been jealous of my wife, jealous of our kids' achievements, jealous of how close our family was. Deborah grew up in a chaotic home where she never felt good enough. Her parents fought constantly and compared her to her older sister who was perfect at everything. Kyle said Deborah had been projecting that insecurity onto my family for years, trying to tear us down because our happiness reminded her of what she didn't have growing up. I listened, but I didn't let it excuse what Deborah did. I told Kyle that understanding why someone hurts you doesn't make it okay. Kyle agreed immediately. He said he wasn't making excuses, just trying to explain what he'd learned about his wife over the past week. We sat there for another hour talking about everything except what came next. When I got home, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. She begged me to consider family counseling with Kyle and Deborah. She said we needed professional help to work through this, that the family was falling apart. I told her I wasn't ready to sit in a room with Deborah yet, and maybe I never would be. My mother started crying and said she was losing her family, that Emily's death was destroying all of us in different ways. I felt guilty, but I also felt angry that she was making this about her pain instead of respecting my boundaries. I told her I had to go and hung up. That weekend, my wife suggested we take the kids to visit her mother, Hattie. We needed space from my side of the family and all the pressure to forgive and make peace. Hattie lived 2 hours away in a small house with a big backyard. She'd been my wife's rock through everything, never pushing or judging, just being there. We packed bags Friday night and drove out Saturday morning. Hattie opened her door and pulled my wife into a long hug without saying a word. She hugged me next, then got down on her knees to hug our son. She didn't ask about the family drama or Deborah or anything stressful. She just made lunch and let us exist in her space. My son went outside to play in the backyard after we ate. I watched him through the kitchen window, running around with a soccer ball, laughing at something. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in weeks. I realized how much tension he'd been carrying from all the adult drama, how much our family conflict had been weighing on him, even though we tried to shield him from it. Hattie came and stood beside me at the window. She said kids feel everything, even when we think they don't notice. That night after our son went to bed, my wife and I sat on Hattie's back porch drinking tea. The air was cool and quiet. My wife started talking about the funeral, really talking about it for the first time since it happened. She described what it felt like when Deborah pulled her aside near the bathroom. How Deborah waited until my wife was alone, vulnerable, raw from burying our daughter. How Deborah leaned in close and whispered those words. My wife said it felt like being stabbed. She was standing there knowing Emily was in a casket 20 feet away, and Deborah told her it was her fault Emily died. My wife's voice broke, and she said she'd blamed herself every day anyway. She replayed the accident in her mind constantly, wondering what she could have done differently, how she could have prevented it. Deborah's words confirmed her worst fear, that she'd failed as a mother, that Emily's death was punishment for not being good enough. I moved closer and pulled my wife against me. She sobbed into my shoulder while I held her. I told her that Emily's death was a terrible accident and not her fault, that she was an incredible mother to our kids. My wife pulled back and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. She asked if I ever blamed her. The question hung in the air between us. I thought about lying, about protecting her from the truth, but we'd been through too much for anything less than honesty. I told her that in my darkest moments I'd blamed everyone, including myself. I'd replayed the accident looking for someone to hold responsible because the randomness of it was too painful to accept. But I knew rationally that accidents happen, and no one could have prevented it. My wife started crying harder, and I held her again. We cried together for the first time in months, really cried about losing Emily instead of being angry at Deborah. We cried for our baby girl who would never grow up, never go to prom, never graduate college, never give us grandchildren. We cried for the life we'd planned that would never happen. We cried until we had nothing left. Hattie found us on the porch hours later, still holding each other in the dark. She didn't say anything, just put blankets around our shoulders and went back inside. My wife and I sat there until the sun started to rise, finally beginning the grief work we'd been avoiding for 4 months. We got home late Sunday night, and I saw the white envelope in our mailbox right away. No return address, just my wife's name written in Deborah's handwriting. My wife's hands shook as she opened it. 4 pages fell out, handwritten on lined paper like something from a notebook. I watched my wife's face as she read the first page. Her eyes moved slowly across each line. She didn't say anything. The letter started with an apology for the pool party, then moved into deeper stuff. Deborah wrote about being jealous of us for years. She admitted feeling inadequate every time she saw our kids doing well or our family looking happy. She wrote that she's been in therapy since I told Kyle what happened at the funeral. Her therapist helped her see patterns she didn't recognize before. Deborah explained how she lashes out when she feels small, how she tries to make other people hurt when she's hurting inside. My wife finished the first page and moved to the second. I stood there waiting. The second page got more specific. Deborah wrote about the funeral and what she said to my wife near the bathroom. She admitted she said the cruelest thing she could think of in that moment. She wrote that she wanted my wife to hurt as much as Deborah hurts inside every day. She said she's been miserable in her own life for longer than she can remember. She resents our happiness because she doesn't have any herself. She wrote that she's genuinely sorry for taking her pain out on our family. My wife read through all 4 pages twice without speaking. Then she set the letter down on the kitchen counter and looked at me. She said she didn't know what to do with this information. I picked up the letter and read it myself. The words felt too convenient, too perfectly timed to make Deborah sympathetic right when Kyle was deciding about their marriage. I told my wife it seemed like Deborah was trying to save her relationship by making herself look like a victim of her own issues. My wife nodded slowly. She said even if Deborah meant every word, it didn't undo the damage. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't make it safe to have them in your life. We stood in the kitchen talking about it for over an hour. We agreed that knowing Deborah's pain doesn't mean we have to forgive her or pretend the last few years didn't happen. My phone buzzed around midnight. Text from Kyle asking if we got a letter from Deborah. I texted back that yes, we got it, but it doesn't change anything for us right now. Kyle responded that Deborah's therapist wants to do a joint session with all of us. I stared at that message for a full minute before replying. I told him we're not ready for that, and we might never be ready. Kyle texted back that he understood. He said he's disappointed, but he gets it. Then he added that he's still trying to figure out if his marriage can survive this, or if it should. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sent back that I'm here if he needs to talk. 2 weeks went by without much contact from anyone in the family. Then Lana called one afternoon while I was at work. I almost didn't answer because I was tired of family drama. But Lana has always been decent to us, so I picked up. She started by saying she's been thinking a lot about everything that happened. She told me she's ashamed of herself. She said she witnessed Deborah's comments toward my family for years and never spoke up. She prioritized keeping peace over protecting us. Lana apologized for the text she sent me telling me to extend grace to Deborah. She said she understands now why that was wrong. She told me she supports whatever boundaries I need to set, and she won't pressure me to reconcile with anyone. After Lana's call, I sat in my car in the work parking lot thinking about what she said. Some family members were capable of understanding and growth. Others just wanted to smooth things over without addressing the real problem. That night, my wife and I sat down with a notebook and wrote out what we needed from family members going forward. We needed them to stop pressuring us to reconcile with Deborah. We needed them to stop making excuses for her behavior. We needed them to respect that we might never be comfortable around her again. We needed them to understand that protecting our remaining children came before family unity. We wrote it all down clearly so there wouldn't be any confusion. My son came into the living room while we were writing. He asked if Uncle Kyle would be at his chess tournament next weekend. I looked at my wife and then back at him. I told him I didn't know, but I would find out. After he went to bed, I texted Kyle about the tournament. He responded within 5 minutes saying he wouldn't miss it. He said his relationship with my kids were separate from everything else happening. I felt grateful reading that message. Kyle was trying to maintain his connection with my children despite all the family chaos. The tournament was on Saturday morning at the high school. My son was nervous about it all week. When we got there, he kept looking around for Kyle. I wasn't sure Kyle would actually show up until I saw him walking across the parking lot. My son's face changed completely when he spotted his uncle. Kyle came over and ruffled my son's hair and asked if he was ready to dominate. My son grinned and nodded. The tournament lasted 3 hours. Kyle sat with us in the bleachers and cheered every time my son made a good move. My wife and I watched them together between matches. Kyle leaning down to whisper something to my son laughing at whatever Kyle said. It made me sad seeing how complicated everything had become. Emily's death had broken our family in ways we never expected. Kyle didn't mention Deborah once during the whole tournament. We talked about normal things like work and sports and my son's school. It felt good to have a few hours of regular family time. After the awards ceremony, Kyle asked if he could talk to me alone. We walked to the edge of the parking lot while my wife took our son to get ice cream. Kyle looked tired. He told me he decided to stay married to Deborah. I didn't say anything at first. He explained that he's requiring serious conditions, ongoing therapy for her, complete accountability for her past behavior, zero tolerance for any future cruel comments toward my family. He said he's doing this partly for their kids and the baby coming, but also because he believes Deborah is genuinely trying to change. I told Kyle I respect his decision about his marriage, but I'm not ready to have Deborah in my life again. I might never be ready. Kyle nodded and said he understands completely. He's not asking me to forgive her or see her. He just wants me to not cut him out completely. We stood there in the parking lot working it out. Kyle can maintain separate relationships with me and with Deborah. He won't push us to reconcile. He won't bring Deborah around us. If there are family events, we'll figure out how to handle them as they come. Kyle put his hand on my shoulder and said he's sorry for everything. I told him he doesn't need to apologize for his wife's actions. He's been caught in an impossible situation. We're still brothers, regardless of what happens with Deborah. The next morning, my mother called. I could hear it in her voice before she even started talking. That careful tone she uses when she's trying to hold the family together. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and I knew what was coming. My father came too. We sat in a booth at the diner near their house, and my mother's hands were shaking around her coffee cup. She told me she understood why I needed space from Deborah. She said she respected my boundaries. Then she started crying and said she couldn't stand the thought of splitting up family gatherings. My father put his hand over hers and looked at me. He said they needed to figure out a way to make holidays work for everyone. I told them I wasn't ready to be in the same room as Deborah. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas. Maybe not ever. My mother's face crumpled and she asked how we were supposed to do this. I suggested separate gatherings, one that I attend and one that Deborah attends. Kyle could go to both if he wanted. My mother looked at my father like she was waiting for him to fix this. My father surprised me by nodding. He said if that's what it takes, then that's what we'll do. My mother started to argue, but my father squeezed her hand and told her this wasn't negotiable. Our family had been through enough. If I needed distance from Deborah to protect my wife and kids, then everyone else would have to adjust. My mother wiped her eyes and agreed, but I could see how much it hurt her. She said the family being divided was breaking her heart. I felt guilty sitting there watching my mother cry. Part of me wanted to take it back and say I'd try harder. But then I thought about my wife's face at the funeral. I thought about what Deborah whispered to her. I stayed firm. We worked out a rotation. Thanksgiving at my parents' house without Deborah. Christmas at Kyle's house without us. Easter back at my parents' with us. Summer barbecue with Deborah. My mother wrote it all down on a napkin like she was afraid she'd forget. Kyle would go to everything. He'd split his time between both sides of this divide we'd created. 3 weeks passed. My wife spent most of that time quiet. Not sad exactly. More like she was working something out in her head. One night after our son went to bed, she told me she wanted to write a letter to Deborah. Not to forgive her, just to say what she needed to say. I asked if she was sure, and she nodded. She said Deborah's apology letter had been sitting in her mind and she needed to respond. Not for Deborah's sake, for her own. She spent 2 days writing it. I'd come home from work and find her at the kitchen table with pages of crossed-out sentences scattered around her. She'd write something and then crumple it up. Start over. Write more. Crumple again. I didn't push. I just brought her coffee and let her work through it. The final version was 3 pages. She read it to me before she sealed the envelope. Her hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. The letter explained exactly what Deborah's comment at the funeral had done to her. How it had taken her grief and twisted it into something worse. How she'd already been blaming herself every single day for not preventing the accident. How Deborah's words had confirmed every horrible thought she'd been having about failing as a mother. My wife's voice broke when she read that part, but she kept going. She told Deborah that she needed her to stay away indefinitely, that she needed Deborah to never speak about Emily again, to anyone, ever. She wrote that she hoped Deborah would get help and become healthier for her own children, but their relationship was over. There was no coming back from what Deborah had said. My wife folded the letter and put it in the envelope. She addressed it and stuck a stamp on it. Then she sat there holding it. I asked if she wanted me to mail it, and she shook her head. She said she needed to do this herself. The next morning, she drove to the post office and dropped it in the mailbox. When she came home, she looked lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy and finally set it down. Deborah's response came 4 days later. My wife opened it at the kitchen table, and I stood behind her reading over her shoulder. It was short, maybe half a page. Deborah wrote that she accepted my wife's boundaries, that she would respect them, that she understood their relationship was over, and she wouldn't try to change that. She promised never to mention Emily's name again. That was it. No long explanation, no defense of herself, no begging for another chance, just acceptance. My wife read it twice and then set it down. She told me there was something about the shortness of it that felt real. Like Deborah had finally stopped trying to explain herself and just listened. I wasn't sure I believed Deborah's transformation was genuine. People don't change that fast. But I had to admit she was at least respecting the boundaries we'd set. Kyle called me that evening. He said Deborah had cried when she read my wife's letter. That she'd admitted she deserved every word. That she wasn't going to fight it or try to fix it. She was just going to stay away like my wife asked. Kyle's voice was tired. He told me he knew I didn't trust Deborah, and he didn't blame me. He said he was still figuring out his own feelings about everything. But he appreciated that Deborah was finally taking accountability instead of making excuses. We had a session with Ronald 2 days later. My wife brought both letters, Deborah's apology and her response. Ronald read them carefully, and then asked us how we felt about the boundaries we'd established. My wife said she felt relieved, like she'd finally been able to speak her truth instead of just swallowing the hurt. I said I felt protective, still angry, still not ready to let Deborah anywhere near my family. Ronald nodded and set the letters down. He told us something we weren't expecting. He said we'd been so focused on the conflict with Deborah that we'd been avoiding the deeper grief work about Emily. That we'd been using our anger at Deborah as a shield, a way to not face the unbearable pain of losing our daughter. My wife started crying. She said she knew he was right, that being angry at Deborah was easier than accepting that Emily was gone. Ronald asked us when we'd last talked about Emily, really talked about her, about who she was and what we missed and how much it hurt. We both sat there silent. It had been months. We'd been so consumed with the Deborah situation that we'd stopped processing our actual grief. Ronald leaned forward and told us gently that we needed to start doing that work, that we needed to share memories of Emily, talk about the trauma of losing her, stop channeling all our pain into rage at Deborah and start facing what we'd actually lost. That night, my wife and I sat in the living room after our son went to bed. We didn't turn on the TV. We just sat there in the quiet. My wife said she wanted to go into Emily's room. We'd kept the door closed since she died. Neither of us had been able to face it. I took her hand and we walked down the hallway together. I opened the door and turned on the light. Everything was exactly how Emily had left it. Her bed was unmade. Her stuffed animals were piled in the corner. Her drawings were scattered across her desk. My wife walked over to the desk and picked up a picture Emily had drawn of our family. All 5 of us holding hands with a big sun in the corner. She started crying. Not the angry crying from before. Something deeper. I put my arms around her, and we stood there looking at our daughter's room. At all the pieces of her that were left behind. We spent 2 hours in there, going through her drawings one by one, holding her clothes and remembering when she wore them, reading the stories she'd written in her notebooks. It was brutal. Every item felt like a knife. But it was also necessary. We'd been so busy being angry that we'd forgotten to actually grieve. We sat on Emily's bed together, and my wife told me she'd been stuck in this place where she couldn't move forward, where the grief felt too big to face, so she'd just stayed angry at Deborah instead. I admitted I'd been doing the same thing, using Deborah as a target for pain that had nowhere else to go. Our son found us there an hour later. He stood in the doorway looking surprised. He asked if he could come in, and we nodded. He sat between us on Emily's bed and picked up one of her stuffed animals, a purple elephant she'd named Jared. He said he missed her, that he thought about her every day, that he'd been scared to talk about her around us because we always seemed so sad or so angry. He didn't want to make it worse. My wife pulled him close and told him he could always talk about Emily, that we wanted to hear his memories, that we needed to remember her together instead of keeping it all locked inside. Our son started talking then, about how Emily used to steal his chess pieces and hide them around the house, about how she'd make up songs about nothing and sing them at the top of her lungs, about how she'd climb into his bed during thunderstorms, even though she was too old for that. We all cried together, but it felt different from the crying we'd done before. This felt like healing instead of breaking, like we were finally letting ourselves feel the loss instead of running from it. A month after the confrontation, Kyle sent me a text. Just a photo. A tiny baby with dark hair and Kyle's nose. My new nephew. Born that morning. 7 pounds. Healthy. I stared at that photo for a long time. This innocent baby who was part of my family but connected to someone who'd hurt us so deeply. I showed my wife and waited for her reaction. She surprised me. She said we should send a gift. That the baby didn't do anything wrong. That he deserved to be welcomed into the family. I asked if she was sure, and she nodded. She said she was angry at Deborah, but that didn't mean we had to punish Kyle's children. We went to the baby store that weekend, picked out a soft blanket and some tiny clothes. My wife wrote a card. She was careful with the words, congratulating Kyle, welcoming the baby. No mention of Deborah anywhere. We mailed it the next day. Kyle called 2 days later. His voice cracked when he thanked us. He said it meant everything that we weren't punishing his children for their mother's mistakes. That he'd been worried we'd cut off his whole family. I told him his kids were still my nephews. That had nothing to do with Deborah. That I wanted to be in their lives even if Deborah stayed out of mine. Kyle was quiet for a minute. Then he said he was grateful. That he'd been afraid of losing his brother on top of everything else. I realized then that maintaining this connection with Kyle and his kids mattered to me. That I could keep Deborah permanently outside my circle while still being an uncle to her children. My mother called a week later. She told me they'd had a small gathering at their house to meet the baby. She'd scheduled it for a day when she knew we weren't available. No awkward overlap, no chance of running into Deborah. She sent me photos, the baby sleeping in my father's arms, Kyle looking exhausted but happy. My mother's voice was careful when she described it, like she was testing whether I'd be angry. I told her I appreciated her respecting our boundaries, that I was glad she got to meet her grandson, that the separate gathering system was working better than I'd expected. My mother sounded relieved. She said she'd been worried I'd feel excluded. I told her I didn't feel excluded. I felt protected. There was a difference. A few days after the baby gift arrived, Owen called and invited us over for dinner. Just us, he said. No one else from the family. My wife looked at me when I hung up the phone and asked if I thought it was safe. I told her Owen and Lana had been different lately, more understanding, and that maybe it would be good to spend time with family who weren't trying to fix everything. We showed up on Saturday evening, and Lana answered the door with a hug for both of us, the kind that lasted a few seconds longer than normal. Owen grilled chicken in the backyard while we sat on their patio, and for the first hour we talked about normal things like my son's chess tournaments, and Lana's new job, and the weird weather we'd been having. Then Owen brought up the family situation without any warning. He said he'd been thinking a lot about how everyone handled things with Deborah over the years, how we all just brushed off her comments and told ourselves it wasn't that bad. Lana jumped in and said they realized they'd been part of the problem by always pushing for peace instead of calling out behavior that needed to be addressed. She said watching what happened to us made them look at their own patterns, how they'd rather keep things comfortable than deal with real issues. Owen admitted he felt guilty for that text he sent telling me to extend grace, said he should have been supporting us instead of protecting Deborah. My wife started crying quietly and I reached for her hand. I told them we appreciated that more than they knew, that feeling like someone understood made a huge difference. We stayed until almost midnight talking about family dynamics and patterns and how hard it is to break cycles that have been going on for years. When we left, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The next morning, my son came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and asked if he could meet his new baby cousin. I froze with the coffee pot in my hand because I hadn't thought about how to handle this. He said all his friends had baby cousins they got to hold, and he'd never even seen pictures of Kyle's new baby. My wife looked at me from across the kitchen, and I could see she was thinking the same thing I was, that we needed to separate our feelings about Deborah from our son's relationship with his uncle's family. I texted Kyle later that day and asked if he could bring the baby to our parents' house when we were there, giving my son a chance to be a cousin without any awkward run-ins. Kyle responded within minutes saying he'd love that. We set it up for the following Sunday. My parents seemed relieved when I told them the plan, like they'd been worried we'd never let our kids be part of Kyle's family. When Sunday came, we got to my parents' house first, and Kyle showed up 20 minutes later with the baby in a carrier. My son's whole face lit up when Kyle walked through the door. Kyle sat on the couch and carefully handed the baby to my son, showing him how to support the head. I watched my son hold his tiny cousin and felt this weird mix of sadness and gratitude, sad that our family had gotten so complicated, but grateful we were finding ways to make it work. The baby grabbed my son's finger and wouldn't let go, and my son laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months. My wife took pictures with her phone. Kyle and I stood there watching and didn't say much, but I think we both understood what this meant. 6 weeks had passed since that day in my living room when I told Kyle what Deborah said at the funeral. My wife brought it up one evening after the kids were in bed. She said she'd been thinking about Deborah's letter and all that stuff about jealousy and feeling inadequate. I asked if she was having second thoughts about our boundaries, and she shook her head fast. She explained that her therapist had been working with her on the difference between compassion and forgiveness, how you can feel sorry for someone's pain without excusing what they did or letting them back into your life. She said she was starting to understand that Deborah probably has been miserable for a long time, that hurt people. But that understanding doesn't mean we have to pretend it didn't happen or put ourselves in a position to be hurt again. My wife said it was helping her healing process to separate Deborah's behavior from Deborah's humanity, to acknowledge that Deborah is a damaged person without making that our problem to solve. I listened and tried to understand what she meant. It felt important to her, this distinction she was making, and I could see it was giving her some kind of peace. I struggled with the compassion part more than my wife did. Every time I thought about Deborah, my protective instinct kicked in, and I just felt angry about what she put my wife through. I brought it up in my next session with Ronald, and he helped me work through it. He said I could hold firm boundaries while also acknowledging that Deborah is acting out of her own pain, that those two things weren't mutually exclusive. Ronald pointed out that carrying around all this rage was hurting me more than it was hurting Deborah, that she probably had no idea how much space she was taking up in my head. He asked what it would look like to put down some of that anger without giving up the boundaries we'd set. I didn't have a good answer right away. Over the next few sessions, we talked about how I could stop letting Deborah live in my mind rent-free, how I could acknowledge she's broken without forgiving what she did or wanting her in my life. It was hard work, and I'm still not sure I figured it out completely, but I started to feel less consumed by it all. My wife found a grief support group for parents who'd lost children and asked if I wanted to go with her. We drove to a church basement on a Thursday night and sat in a circle with 8 other couples who understood exactly what we were carrying. A woman named Sarah talked about losing her teenage son in a car accident and how her mother-in-law blamed her for letting him drive. A man named James described his sister telling him that his daughter's death was God's way of teaching him a lesson. My wife and I looked at each other when we heard these stories, realizing that what happened with Deborah wasn't unique, that family members saying cruel things after a child dies was sadly common. The group leader talked about how grief brings out the worst in some people, how they project their own fears and pain onto the grieving parents. We shared our story about Deborah and the funeral and the pool party, and everyone nodded like they'd heard versions of it before. After the meeting, 3 different people came up to us and said they'd cut off family members too, that sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that relationships won't survive. We left feeling less alone than we had in months. The group gave us tools for processing grief in healthier ways that didn't involve channeling everything into anger at Deborah. 2 weeks later, my son's teacher called me at work. She said she wanted to let me know that our son had been doing much better in the school lately, more engaged in class and less withdrawn during group activities. She mentioned he'd been struggling for months after Emily died, sitting alone at lunch and not participating in discussions, but something had shifted recently. I thanked her and hung up, then sat at my desk thinking about what had changed. My wife and I had been doing the grief work with Ronald, going to the support group, trying to process Emily's death instead of just being angry about Deborah. We'd also reduced the family drama by setting clear boundaries and sticking to them. Our son had probably picked up on the fact that things felt calmer at home, that we weren't constantly stressed about the next family conflict. Seeing him improve reinforced that we'd made the right choice in setting those boundaries, even though it meant fracturing the family in ways that might never fully heal. Kyle texted me one afternoon saying he needed to talk. We met for coffee, and he told me Deborah had been diagnosed with anxiety and depression issues that had apparently been untreated for years. He was careful to say he wasn't making excuses for her behavior, that the diagnosis didn't undo the damage she'd caused. He explained that her therapist thought a lot of Deborah's lashing out came from these underlying mental health problems, that she'd been struggling with intrusive thoughts and emotional regulation for a long time without getting proper help. Kyle said the diagnosis was helping Deborah understand her patterns and work on actual change through medication and therapy. I listened without showing much reaction because honestly, Deborah's mental health journey wasn't my responsibility, and I didn't feel obligated to care about her progress. I was glad for Kyle's sake that she was getting help, glad for his kids that their mother might become healthier, but it didn't change anything for me and my wife. Kyle seemed to understand that. He didn't ask me to forgive her or reconsider our boundaries. He just wanted me to know what was happening. 2 months after the confrontation, my son came to me upset after school. He'd overheard some family members talking at my parents' house about the situation with Deborah, whispering in the kitchen while he played in the living room. He told me he was tired of adults whispering and fighting, that he just wanted his family to be normal again like it was before Emily died. His words hit me hard because I realized we'd been so focused on protecting him from Deborah that we'd created a different kind of stress with all the family division and tension. My son said he missed when everyone got together for holidays and barbecues, when he could play with all his cousins without it being this complicated thing with separate gatherings and careful scheduling. I sat down with him and tried to explain that sometimes adults have serious disagreements that take a long time to work through. But even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. He was 10 years old and smart enough to know this wasn't a normal disagreement. He asked if we'd ever be a regular family again, and I didn't know how to answer that. That night, my wife and I had a long conversation about what our son needed from us. We'd been so focused on our own pain and boundaries that we hadn't fully considered how the family fracture was affecting our kids. Our son had lost his sister, and then watched his family fall apart, and we'd been so caught up in the Deborah drama that we hadn't created enough space for his grief and confusion. My wife said we needed to be more intentional about building positive family experiences, about not letting the situation with Deborah dominate every aspect of our lives. We talked about finding ways to give our son normalcy and joy instead of just managing conflict and protecting boundaries. She pointed out that we'd been surviving instead of living, that we needed to build a new normal that included connection and happiness, not just grief and division. I agreed but wasn't sure how to make that happen. We decided to start small, to focus on creating good memories as our immediate family while we figured out the bigger picture. We planned a weekend trip to a lake house 2 hours away, just the three of us, something we hadn't done since before Emily died. My wife found a place with a dock and kayaks and a fire pit. We left on a Friday afternoon and didn't tell anyone where we were going or when we'd be back. That first night, we sat by the fire and my son told stories about Emily that made us laugh instead of cry, like the time she convinced him that clouds were made of marshmallows, and he argued with his teacher about it. We stayed up late looking at stars and not talking about Deborah or family drama or any of the heavy stuff that had been weighing us down. The next day, my son went kayaking and caught a fish he was incredibly proud of, even though we had to throw it back. My wife and I sat on the dock holding hands and watching him, and I felt something shift inside me. That evening, we walked along the shore, and my son ran ahead collecting rocks, and my wife leaned into me and said she thought we might actually be okay eventually. I kissed the top of her head and watched the sunset turn the water orange and pink. For the first time in months, I felt like she might be right, that we were building something new from all the broken pieces, that maybe we could find our way to a life that included both the grief of losing Emily and the joy of being together. When we got back home, I texted Kyle. I asked if he wanted to grab breakfast sometime, just the two of us. No family drama, no talking about Deborah, just brothers. He wrote back in less than a minute saying yes. We picked a diner halfway between our houses and decided to make it a weekly thing. The first morning felt weird walking in and seeing him already sitting in a booth by the window. We ordered coffee and didn't say much at first. Kyle asked about our son, and I asked about his kids and the new baby. We talked about work and the weather and stupid stuff we saw online. It took maybe 20 minutes before either of us relaxed enough to stop feeling like we were walking on broken glass. Then Kyle brought up the time we tried to build a treehouse when we were kids, and Dad had to come rescue us because we got stuck on the roof. I laughed and reminded him how Mom made us promise never to use power tools without supervision again. By the time we left, my face hurt from smiling. It felt good to remember we were brothers before any of this mess happened. My mother called a few days later saying she and Dad wanted to do a big holiday gathering and needed to know how to handle things with me and Deborah. I told her straight up I wasn't ready to be in the same room as Deborah. She asked if I thought I'd ever be ready, and I said I didn't know, but probably not anytime soon. I asked if they could do separate celebrations again like they did for the baby. My mother was quiet for a minute, and then she said okay, without arguing or trying to change my mind. She told me she was starting to understand this wasn't just me being stubborn, that what Deborah did wasn't something that would blow over in a few months. I thanked her for getting it, and she said she loved me. After we hung up, I sat there feeling relieved that at least my parents were finally accepting this was permanent, not temporary. My wife surprised me that night when we were getting ready for bed. She said she'd been thinking about Deborah and family events. I figured she was going to say she wanted to keep avoiding her forever, which would have been fine with me. Instead, she told me she might be willing to be in the same space as Deborah eventually. Not because she forgave her or wanted a relationship, but because she didn't want to miss important family stuff forever. She said she wasn't ready yet, and might never want to actually interact with Deborah, but she was working toward a place where Deborah's presence didn't control her choices. I stared at her, not knowing what to say. My wife has always been stronger than me, but this was something else. I told her I was amazed by her, and she kissed my cheek and said she was just tired of letting Deborah take up so much space in her head. Our next session with Ronald turned into a conversation about what healing actually means. My wife explained what she'd told me about maybe being willing to be around Deborah someday. Ronald nodded and said, healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about reaching a place where the hurt doesn't run your whole life anymore. He looked at me and said my wife seemed further along in that process than I was. I admitted he was right. Ronald asked what it might look like if we were eventually in the same space as Deborah. My wife said clear boundaries and barely any interaction. I said I didn't know if I could do it without losing my temper. Ronald told us we didn't have to figure it all out right now, that we were allowed to take our time and move at whatever pace felt right. My wife reached over and held my hand. Kyle mentioned during one of our breakfasts that Deborah had written letters to our parents and to Owen and Lana. He said she wasn't asking for anything, just taking responsibility for how she'd acted over the years. I didn't say much because I didn't really care what Deborah was doing. A few days later, my mother brought it up when she called. She said she was impressed by how consistent Deborah had been with therapy and how she seemed genuinely willing to accept whatever consequences came her way. Owen said something similar when I saw him at the hardware store. He told me Deborah's letter to him and Lana was honest and didn't make excuses. I listened and nodded, but inside I was still skeptical. Then I noticed something weird. When people brought up Deborah's name, I didn't feel that immediate spike of rage anymore. It was still there, but duller, like background noise instead of an alarm going off. I wasn't sure if that meant I was healing or just getting tired of being angry all the time. Ronald's office 3 months after everything went down with Kyle and Deborah. I sat on the couch staring at the floor trying to figure out how to say what I'd been thinking about all week. Ronald waited without pushing. Finally, I told him I'd been using my anger at Deborah to avoid dealing with the fact that Emily was gone and never coming back. The words came out shaky and I had to stop and breathe. Ronald leaned forward and asked me to say more about that. I explained that being mad at Deborah gave me something to focus on, someone to blame, a problem I could try to fix. But underneath all that anger was this unbearable truth that my daughter died, and nothing I did would bring her back. Ronald said the confrontation with Deborah was necessary for setting boundaries, but that I'd been holding on to the conflict as a way to distract myself from grief. Hearing him say it out loud made something crack open in my chest. I put my face in my hands and cried harder than I had since the day we buried Emily. The next few weeks were brutal. My wife and I started doing intensive grief work with Ronald. We talked about the accident in detail for the first time, going through every moment leading up to it. We talked about the guilt we both carried, the what-ifs that kept us up at night, our fear that something would happen to our son, too. We talked about how the world felt dangerous now, in a way it never had before. How we couldn't trust that our remaining child would be safe no matter how careful we were. Ronald pushed us through the hardest conversations we'd ever had. Some sessions I left feeling worse than when I arrived, but slowly we started feeling more connected to each other, instead of just surviving side by side. Our son noticed the difference. He told my wife we seemed more present when we talked to him now. That night I held my wife and we both cried, but it felt different from before. Like we were finally letting ourselves feel the full weight of losing Emily, instead of channeling everything into anger at Deborah. I wrote a letter to Deborah one Saturday afternoon while my wife took our son to a movie. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote everything I needed to say about what she'd done and how it affected my family. I wrote about the boundaries that would stay in place no matter what she did going forward. I wrote that I understood she was damaged and hurting, but that didn't excuse the pain she caused us. The letter ended up being 4 pages long. When I finished, I read it over twice and then took it to the fireplace. I lit a match and watched the pages burn. Something shifted inside me as the paper turned to ash. Deborah was still a person who hurt my family. The boundaries were still necessary, but she didn't need to take up so much space in my head anymore. I swept up the ashes and threw them away. Kyle called me after our breakfast one morning and asked if he could stop by the house. He showed up 20 minutes later and we sat on the back porch with beers even though it was barely noon. He told me he was proud of the work my wife and I were doing. He said he could see the difference in how we seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down. Then he thanked me for not cutting him out completely despite everything with Deborah. I told him he was my brother and that wasn't going to change. Kyle admitted his marriage was still complicated and probably always would be. He said Deborah was doing better, but he knew he'd have to stay alert, keep her accountable, make sure she never crossed those lines again. He told me he was committed to protecting his kids and building a healthier family, even if it meant his marriage looked different from he'd imagined. I respected that, even though I wouldn't have made the same choice. We sat there drinking our beers and watching the sun move across the yard, not saying much but feeling solid in a way we hadn't in months. 4 months after I told Kyle what Deborah said at the funeral, my parents threw a barbecue. My mother called ahead to tell me Deborah would be there and asked if we were still coming. My wife looked at me when I hung up and said she wanted to go. I asked if she was sure and she nodded. We drove over with our son and my stomach was tight the whole way. When we pulled up, I saw Deborah's car already parked on the street. We walked into the backyard, and there she was standing near the grill talking to Kyle's mom. Deborah saw us and her whole body went stiff. She didn't come over. She didn't wave. She just gave a small nod and turned back to her conversation. My wife squeezed my hand. We stayed on the opposite side of the yard most of the afternoon. Our son ran around with his cousins and didn't seem bothered by any of the adult tension. Deborah kept her distance. She didn't try to approach us or force any interaction. When we left a few hours later, my wife was quiet in the car. I asked how she felt and she said awkward but manageable. She told me she felt strong for facing it instead of hiding from it. I reached over and held her hand while I drove and thought maybe we really were going to be okay. The next family gathering happens at my parents' place 2 weeks after the barbecue, and I watch my son running across the backyard with his cousins like nothing ever changed. He doesn't notice how Deborah stays near the house while we stay by the fence, doesn't see the careful choreography of adults moving around each other in wide circles. He just plays and laughs and acts like the kid he should get to be. My wife squeezes my hand and says she's glad we came, that seeing him this happy makes the awkwardness worth it. I realize we're building something different from what we had before. Not the perfect unified family my mother always wanted, but something honest that works for us. Owen finds me by the cooler an hour later and pulls me aside near the garage where no one can hear us. He tells me he's been watching Deborah at these gatherings, and he sees real changes, how she doesn't make those little cutting remarks anymore, how she seems more aware of herself and less defensive. I listen and nod, but I tell him I'm glad for Kyle and the kids, that I hope Deborah keeps growing and healing for their sake. Owen asks if there's any chance my boundaries might shift over time, and I'm honest with him. I say I don't know what the future holds, but right now the distance feels necessary and healthy for my family. Owen puts his hand on my shoulder and says he gets it, that some wounds go too deep to fully heal even when people change. He tells me he respects what I'm doing, and he's not going to push me toward forgiveness anymore. We stand there quiet for a minute, and then head back to the party, and I feel grateful for family members who can understand without making me feel guilty. My wife brings up visiting Emily's grave on Saturday morning while we're having coffee, and I know immediately that she's ready for something we've been avoiding. We've been to the cemetery a few times since the burial, but we've never really talked to Emily, never said the things we needed to say. We drive there together in silence and park near the small stone with her name and dates carved into gray granite. My wife kneels down first and touches the grass growing over the grave, and I kneel beside her and take her hand. We tell Emily about her brother winning his chess tournament last month and how proud we are of him. We tell her about the new baby cousin she would have loved to hold and play with. We tell her we miss her every single day, that we think about her laugh and her drawings and the way she used to steal food off our plates at dinner. My wife starts crying, but it's different from the crying we've done before, less like drowning and more like letting something go. I cry too, and we hold each other on the grass, and I feel like we're finally saying goodbye in a way we couldn't at the funeral when everything was too raw and impossible. We stay there for a long time just talking to her and crying, and eventually we stand up knowing we're going to be okay, even though we'll never be the same people we were before we lost her. Life settles into a rhythm over the next few months where my family keeps careful boundaries with Deborah while staying connected to Kyle and everyone else. The grief over Emily is still there every day, but it doesn't crush us anymore. Doesn't stop us from laughing or planning things or enjoying moments with our son. We're learning to carry the loss alongside the living, to hold space for both the pain and the joy without letting either one take over completely. I realized that protecting my family meant making hard choices that fractured some relationships, and I've made peace with that, knowing some things matter more than keeping everyone comfortable. Kyle and I meet for breakfast every week, and we're solid as brothers, talking about our kids and our lives without the weight of the Deborah situation hanging over every conversation. My wife is stronger than I've ever seen her, speaking up for herself and setting boundaries and building a life that honors Emily's memory without being consumed by grief. Our son is thriving in a family that's honest about being broken and committed to moving forward anyway. We'll never get back what we lost when Emily died, and we'll never be the people we were before. But we're building something real from the pieces that remain, something that feels true even if it's not perfect.